The fog came in off the bayou the way it always did in late September. Low and unhurried, pooling first in the cypress knees along the water's edge, and then climbing, slow as breath, up the sloped lawn toward the house. By 7 in the morning it had reached the screened porch, soft and gray, so that the wrought iron table where the Belmonts took their Sunday breakfast seemed to float a little above the world, suspended in something that was not quite weather and not quite silence. Elena Marchand had lived at Cypress Landing for 14 months, and she had still not stopped noticing things the rest of the family had long since stopped seeing. The particular sweetness of magnolia wrought in the humid air. The way the old cypress boards of the porch floor had been worn pale and silver in a path exactly as wide as 100 years of footsteps. The sound, she noticed it every single morning, and every single morning it unsettled her a little more, of the kettle in the kitchen being filled at precisely 6:45, followed by Vivian's low, unhurried humming, a French lullaby Elena had never learned the words to and had, more than once, dreamed about in a language she did not speak. She sat now with her hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea she had not asked for, watching her daughter trace slow circles in the condensation sweating down the side of a water glass. Mia was 7, all elbows and watchfulness, dressed in the yellow sundress Elena had laid out for her the night before, her dark hair still slightly flattened on one side from sleep. She had inherited her father Raphael's seriousness, the particular stillness of a person who thinks before speaking, who weighs a room before entering it, and some mornings, watching her, Elena felt the old grief rise fresh and sharp in her chest, as though Raphael himself were sitting across the table in miniature, considering something he had not yet decided to say. "Finish your eggs, sweet girl," Elena said, more out of habit than expectation. Mia rarely finished her eggs on Sunday mornings. She preferred, these days, to watch the porch rather than eat on it. Down the lawn, past the boxwood hedge Augustine Belmont had planted the year Thomas was born, the bayou moved without hurry past the old boathouse, its dock posts silvered with age, a single blue heron picking its way along the shallows in search of breakfast of its own. A mockingbird somewhere in the live oaks had begun, as it did every morning, running through its entire repertoire of borrowed songs, a cardinal's whistle, a car alarm, something that might have once been a telephone ring, filling the fog with a strange, cheerful chaos that no one at the table seemed to hear any more except Elena and, she suspected, Mia. Mia set down her fork. She did not eat the eggs. Instead, she slid off her chair with the deliberate, unhurried purpose of a child executing a plan she had rehearsed. Elena would understand only later how many mornings her daughter had lain awake rehearsing exactly this, and walked around the table, her bare feet silent on the worn cypress boards, until she was close enough to press her mouth almost against her mother's ear. "Mommy," she whispered. Her breath was warm, smelling faintly of orange juice. "She's trying to kill you." Elena went still, not the stillness of alarm, not yet, but the small, automatic stillness of a parent's mind performing triage on a sentence, deciding in half a second whether what she has just heard is a child's game, a half-understood cartoon plot, an overheard fragment from a movie she shouldn't have watched, or something else entirely. "Who, baby?" Elena kept her voice soft, pitched for her daughter's ear. Alone, her eyes still on the fog, on the heron, on anything that would make the question look, to anyone glancing over from the kitchen window, like idle morning chatter. "Who do you mean?" Mia's gaze flicked once, sharp and quick, toward the screen door, toward the sound, just audible over the mockingbird, of a kettle being lifted from the stove, of that low unhurried humming resuming exactly where it had left off, as though it had never stopped at all. "You'll be mad," Mia whispered. "You won't believe me. You never believe me when it's about her." Something in the sentence, asterisk when it's about her asterisk, as though this were not the first time, as though there had been other mornings, other whispers Elena had somehow failed to properly hear, made the fog around them feel suddenly colder than the season accounted for. "I will always believe you," Elena said, and meant it with an ache that surprised her. Mia studied her mother's face the way she studied everything lately. Carefully, from a small protective distance, the way a person examines a stove they have once been burned by before deciding whether it is safe to touch again. "Not her," she finally said, and her small voice cracked on the last word, betraying, for just a moment, the 7-year-old underneath the careful composure. "The other one." Elena opened her mouth to ask which other one, to ask her daughter to. Please say the name plainly so that this fear could be given a shape small enough to manage, but the screen doors swung open before the question could form, and Vivian Belmont stepped out onto the porch. With a fresh pot of tea balanced on a silver tray, her silver hair perfectly set even at this hour, her smile arranged with the effortless warmth of a woman who has never once, in 70 years, been caught looking like anything other than exactly what she wished to appear. "Good morning, my darlings," she said, setting the tray down with a small ceramic clink. "Who wants more?" Mia slipped back into her chair without a word, picked up her fork, and began, very deliberately, to eat her eggs. To understand what Mia meant that morning, and why it would take her mother 11 days to understand it too, it helps first to understand the house she set it in, because Cypress Landing was never simply a building. It was an argument, built in wood and brick and old family money, about who the Belmonts believed themselves to be. The main house had stood on this bend of the bayou since 1911, raised on brick piers against the floodline by Augustine's grandfather, Etienne Belmont, a man family legend remembered as both a devout churchgoer and, in the years just before Prohibition tightened its grip on the Gulf Coast, an enthusiastic smuggler of rum through the same shrimp boats that made his fortune respectable in daylight. The house he built reflected both halves of him, a wide, columned front gallery meant for Sunday visitors and church committee meetings, and, tucked behind the kitchen wing where no visitors I would naturally wander, a warren of small utility rooms, root cellar, drawing room, a narrow, cold pantry, with its own outside door, that had, in Etienne's day, moved more than vegetables. By the time Thomas Belmont inherited the house and the shipping company that shared its name, the smuggling had long since given way to something more sophisticated and, on paper, entirely legal: Belmont Shipping and Logistics, responsible now for nearly a third of the container traffic moving through the port of New Orleans, its fleet grown from 3 shrimp boats to 40 ocean-capable cargo vessels, its offices occupying 4 floors of a glass tower downtown that bore, in brushed steel letters 2 feet tall, the family name. The house itself had become, over 4 generations, less a home than a kind of private museum that happened to have working plumbing, oil, portraits of Belmont men in high collars and later in the wide lapels of the 1970s line the curving main staircase, their painted eyes following visitors with the same polite, appraising suspicion the family had cultivated in life. The library, paneled floor to ceiling in Cypress that had darkened over a century to the color of strong coffee, held first editions of maritime law texts no one had opened in decades, and a globe, pre-1961, that still showed a Congo that no longer existed under that name. The formal dining room seated 22 on a table. Etienne himself had commissioned, and was used, on most ordinary nights, by exactly 3 people, their voices swallowed up in a room built for 40. Elena had grown up 70 minutes and an entire universe away in a narrow shotgun house in Gentilly with a mother who taught 3rd grade at the public school 2 blocks over and a father who drove a delivery route for a wholesale grocery distributor, leaving before dawn 6 days a week and coming home smelling of diesel and cardboard. Dinner in that house had been eaten at a kitchen table with a wobbly leg her father had never quite fixed, for plates crowded close enough that conversation happened whether anyone wanted it to or not. She had married Raphael Marchand at 24, a warehouse foreman with an easy laugh and enormous, careful hands, and had believed, for 6 years, that she had built exactly the kind of small, warm, unremarkable life she had always wanted. Then Raphael had died on a Tuesday afternoon in March, crushed beneath a forklift whose safety inspection records, it later emerged in a lawsuit, Elena had been too exhausted with grief to fully pursue, had been falsified for 11 months by a supervisor trying to hit a quarterly efficiency bonus. The company had settled quietly, quickly, generously, by the standards of such things, with a confidentiality clause that meant Elena could never publicly say what had actually happened to the father of her 4-year-old daughter. She had taken the money because there had been nothing else to take. She had gone back to substitute teaching because the alternative was drowning. And 18 months later, at a fundraiser for the elementary school where she'd taken a long-term position, she had met a quiet, guarded man named Thomas Belmont, who had asked her not how the Belmont shipping donation would be allocated, not what she thought of the silent auction items, but how she was actually, truly doing, in a voice that suggested he already suspected the honest answer was not well, and something in Elena, exhausted from a 1.5 years of performing fine for everyone's comfort, had simply told him the truth. She had married him 14 months ago. She had not married him for Cypress Landing or the glass tower downtown or the 40 cargo ships. She had married him because he was the first person since Raphael's death who had made her feel, for one entire dinner conversation, like a whole person instead of a widow who happened to also teach 4th grade. What she had not fully understood, in the slow fog of grief and gratitude that had carried her into this marriage, was that she had not simply married a man. She had married a house, a name, 100 years of careful silences behind a cold pantry door, and a mother-in-law who had run every version of this family, quietly and completely, since before Elena had been old enough to understand what running a family even meant. If Elena had an ally at Cypress Landing in those first 14 months, someone who saw her not as an interesting development in the Belmont family story, but simply as a tired young woman trying to learn the rhythms of an unfamiliar house, it was Odette Fontenot, who had cooked and kept house at Cypress Landing for 26 years and had buried a husband, raised 2 sons now grown and moved to Houston, and outlasted, by her own count, 4 different household managers Vivian had hired and quietly dismissed over the decades for reasons Odette never fully explained and Elena never quite worked up the nerve to ask about. Odette's domain was the kitchen at the back of the house, large, warm, smelling always of roux and strong coffee, its windows looking out over the same fog Elena watched from the porch, but from an angle that let Odette see the whole working length of the property, the kitchen, garden, the old smokehouse, the narrow path that led past the drying room and the cold pantry, down to the boathouse itself. It was Odette who had first taught Elena, gently and without ever making her feel foolish, the small unspoken rules of the house, which of the antique chairs in the front parlor were for sitting in and which were, despite appearances, only for looking at, which topics were safe at Sunday dinner and which Thomas's late father, mostly, and the exact mechanics of the shipping company's finances were handled by long family habit with a delicacy Elena had initially mistaken for secrecy, and only slowly come to understand actually was secrecy dressed up as good manners. "You'll learn this house the way water learns a channel," Odette had told her once, in the first month of the marriage, kneading biscuit dough with the unhurried competence of 40 years' practice. Slow and mostly by finding out where it don't want you to go. Elena had laughed at the time. She thought of that sentence often now, in the days after the garden table whisper, turning it over the way she'd once turned over a difficult line of poetry, looking for a meaning she suspected had been there all along, waiting for her to be ready to see it. On the Tuesday after Mia's warning, Elena found herself in Odette's kitchen mid-morning, ostensibly helping shell a bowl of field peas, actually working up the nerve to ask a question she had been circling for 2 days. "Odette," she said finally, not looking up from the peas. "How well did you know Mr. Augustine before he died?" Odette's hands did not stop moving, but something in the set of her shoulders changed, a small, careful stillness Elena was learning that week to recognize as the particular posture of someone deciding how much truth a question deserved. "Well enough," Odette said. "I started here the year before it happened." He was a serious man. Quiet, like Mr. Thomas is now, only harder underneath it. He used to walk the property alone most evenings, down to the water, thinking on something. Never did say what. "Did you ever hear?" Elena hesitated, aware she was standing at the edge of a question with no easy way to walk it back once asked. "Did you ever hear anything about the accident that didn't quite sit right?" Odette set down her paring knife. For a long moment she said nothing at all, and the only sound in the kitchen was the low bubble of a pot on the back burner and, faint through the window, the mockingbird resuming its morning repertoire out in the live oaks. "Miss Elena," she said at last, and her voice had dropped to something careful and low-pitched. Elena understood, the same way Mia had pitched her own whisper 2 days before, for one set of ears only. "I have worked in this house 26 years, and there is exactly one thing I have learned to be true about the Belmont family, and I will tell it to you once, because you asked me plain, and because I think somebody in this house ought to tell you something plain before it's too late to matter. Everybody in this parish will tell you Miss Vivian is the kindest woman they know, and every single one of them is telling you the truth about the only version of her they've ever been shown." She picked the knife back up. She did not say another word about it that day or for a long while afterward. But she did something Elena would only understand the significance of much later. She began, from that Tuesday forward, quietly keeping her own eye on the little room behind the pantry, the one with the outside door Etienne Belmont had built for purposes no one in the family discussed anymore, and on whoever went in and out of it, and when there was, in fairness to Elena's first and wrong assumption, another woman in Thomas Belmont's orbit who had made absolutely no secret of wanting Elena gone, and it is worth spending a full scene in her company to understand exactly how convincing a decoy she made. Renata Voss was the wife of Karl Voss, who ran the Gulf Coast's second largest shipping brokerage from an office 2 blocks from Belmont's glass tower, and had spent 15 years losing contracts to Thomas's company with the particular, curdling bitterness of a man who believed himself the smarter operator and could never quite forgive the market for disagreeing. Renata herself had grown up one generation removed from old money in a house not unlike Cypress Landing, and had spent her entire adult life fighting a quiet, exhausting battle to be taken as seriously as women who had been born, rather than married, into rooms like the ones she now occupied. Elena had first properly met her at the Terrebonne Founders Gala the autumn after the wedding, an evening of string quartets and silent auctions in a hotel ballroom hung with the state's history and gilt framed portraits. Renata had approached her near the bar with a glass of champagne in one hand and a smile that did not reach anywhere near her eyes. "So you're the one," Renata had said, looking Elena over with the unhurried thoroughness of a woman pricing a piece of furniture. "I have to say, when I heard Thomas Belmont had remarried a schoolteacher, I assumed it was a joke someone was playing on the society column." "It wasn't a joke," Elena had said, keeping her voice light the way she'd learned, in a year of these rooms, to keep her voice light around women like Renata. "No," Renata had agreed, sipping her champagne. "I suppose not. My daughter Camille, did you know she and Thomas were, well, everyone always assumed before you came along, of course. Funny how these things work out. Or don't." She'd smiled again, wider this time, cruelty dressed carefully as candor. "Some women marry up, of course. And some women marry strategically. It's always so interesting to see over time which kind you've ended up with." Elena had walked away from that conversation with her hands shaking slightly at her sides, and Mia, seated at a nearby table with a plate of untouched petit fours, 6 years old at the time, watching the ballroom with the same careful stillness she brought to everything had watched the entire exchange from 20 feet away and understood, in the wordless ways small children absorb the emotional weather of a room long before they can name what they've absorbed, that this woman did not like her mother, and that her mother had been hurt by it and had not said so out loud. It happened again at the country club, twice, once over a lunch neither Elena nor Renata had chosen to attend together, but had been seated uncomfortably near, once at a junior tennis tournament where Mia herself had played and Renata had loudly, within earshot of half the gallery, wondered aloud to another mother whether some children simply inherit their mother's tendency to overreach. So when Elena turned her daughter's whisper over and over in her mind, across the days that followed the garden table breakfast, while Vivian poured tea each morning with her unwavering, gracious smile, while Thomas worked later and later in his downtown office on something he would not yet name, while the ordinary rhythms of Cypress Landing resumed around a fear no one but Elena and Mia yet knew to feel, it was Renata Voss's face that kept surfacing, again and again, fully formed and easy to hate. It made a certain terrible, comfortable sense. Renata had motive in the small vicious architecture of old money rivalry, a business rival's resentment, a daughter's lost prospects, a decade of watching the Belmont name eclipse the Voss name at every turn. It was so much easier, Elena would admit to herself only much later, to suspect the woman who had always been openly cruel to her than to sit, even for a moment, with the alternative her daughter had actually whispered, not her, the other one, . She did not ask Mia to clarify that first week. She told herself she did not want to frighten her daughter further by asking her to relive the fear. The truer reason, the one Elena would not let herself examine for another 10 days, was that it was so much safer to be afraid of a woman she already knew how to dislike than to let herself understand that her daughter might have meant the only other woman in this house, who moved through every room, every teacup, every quiet, unwatched corner with total, unquestioned authority. There is a particular kind of grief that does not announce itself. It does not arrive as tears at inconvenient moments, though it can. More often, in Elena's experience, it arrived as a smell, diesel and cut cardboard, the exact smell of Raphael coming home from a shift catching her unexpectedly in a hardware store parking lot 18 months after the funeral, buckling her knees for exactly as long as it took to remember where she was. She had not told Thomas, in their first months of dating, the full weight of what she carried. She had told him the facts: a workplace accident, a young widow, a small daughter, because the facts were true and manageable and did not require her to relive the specific 15 minutes of a Tuesday afternoon when a hospital chaplain had walked toward her waiting room chair with a face that told her everything before he opened his mouth. She had told him the rest on their 6th date, a quiet dinner at a restaurant on Magazine Street, after 2 glasses of wine had loosened something in her chest that she usually kept carefully sealed. The company knew, she'd said, staring at her hands rather than his face. The forklift Raphael was operating had failed 3 separate safety inspections that year. His supervisor kept signing off on it anyway because taking it out of rotation would have missed a quarterly target. I found that out from a lawyer 11 months after the funeral, when I was already too tired to fight for what it would have taken to actually make them answer for it in a courtroom. I took the settlement. I signed the paper that says I can't talk about it publicly. And I have spent every day since wondering if I sold my husband's death for a number on a check so that Mia and I could keep our house. Thomas had not said the things people usually said to her, that Raphael was in a better place, that everything happened for a reason, that time healed all wounds. He had simply reached across the table, taken her hand in both of his, and said, "You didn't sell anything. You survived. The only way anyone gives grieving people the option to survive. That's not the same thing, and anyone who tells you it is has never had to make that choice." It was, Elena would think much later, the single sentence that had made her fall in love with him, not the money, not the house, not the protection his name offered against a world that had already shown her how casually it could take everything, but the fact that he had refused, in that one sentence, to let her carry a guilt that was never hers to carry. What made the whisper at the garden table so unbearable in the days that followed was the specific shape of the fear it reopened. Elena had already lost one person she loved to a danger she had not seen coming in time, to a system that had known something was wrong and chosen silence over safety because the truth was inconvenient. She had built, in the 18 months since Raphael's death, an entire architecture of vigilance around herself and her daughter, checking every car seat twice, reading every ingredient label, asking every question a doctor seemed even slightly reluctant to answer, precisely so that she would never again be the last person in the room to understand that a danger had been sitting in plain sight the whole time. And now her own daughter was telling her, in a whisper meant for no one else, that it was happening again. That somewhere in this beautiful, fog-wrapped house, someone she trusted was doing something quiet and careful that could cost Elena everything, and that Elena herself, for reasons she could not yet name, had not been able to see it. She began, without quite deciding to, watching Vivian more closely. She told herself it was nothing, grief playing tricks, a widow's hypervigilance transposed onto an innocent situation. But she noticed, for the first time in 14 months, that Vivian always prepared the morning tea alone, in the small room behind the pantry, and always emerged with the canister already sealed, the tray already arranged, the warm smile already in place, as though the entire process had been choreographed for an audience that was never meant to see the rehearsal. The tea had started 12 days after Elena's pregnancy was confirmed. As an act of kindness so complete it had made her cry. Vivian had appeared in the kitchen doorway that first morning before Elena had even told her own mother, before Thomas had finished his coffee, holding a small ceramic canister with a hand-painted cypress tree on its lid, worn soft at the edges from handling. "This belonged to my mother-in-law," Vivian had said, setting it on the counter with the reverence of a woman handling something sacred. Chamomile, a little ginger for the morning sickness, raspberry leaf for later, when your body needs it. Belmont women have carried their babies on this tea for 4 generations. I would consider it an honor. Elena, if you'd let me make it for you. Elena had cried a little that morning, not from suspicion, which had not yet occurred to her, but from something closer to relief. She had spent 14 months waiting for a sign that she had been truly absorbed into. This family, rather than merely tolerated inside it, endured as the schoolteacher who had somehow talked her way into the Belmont name. And the tea, offered with such evident love, felt at the time like exactly that sign, finally arriving. What she could not have known, because no one had told her, and Vivian had made certain, with the same meticulous care she applied to every decision she had made in 40 years, that no one ever would, was that Augustine Belmont's own mother had never once made this tea for anyone. That the family blend had been invented 11 days after Mia's whispered warning at the garden table, its component parts purchased in small, unremarkable quantities from 3 separate apothecaries in 3 separate parishes, so that no single receipt, no single pharmacist's memory would ever be able to tell a complete story to anyone who came looking. The chamomile was real. The ginger was real. The raspberry leaf, folded through with a compound so small in dose it would never register on a standard toxicology panel, difficult even for a specialist to isolate, without knowing precisely what to test for, was not part of any family recipe at all. It was a mild, slow-acting vasoconstrictor, the kind occasionally used. Vivian had researched this with the same patient thoroughness she brought to shipping manifests and quarterly filings, across 11 quiet evenings on a laptop that was never connected to the household network, in controlled clinical settings for entirely different purposes, and capable, in slow accumulation across weeks, of producing symptoms that would present to any attending obstetrician as the gradual, entirely plausible onset of preeclampsia, elevated blood pressure, protein in the urine, headaches dismissed as ordinary, pregnancy fatigue, the kind of complication that ended pregnancies quietly, tragically, and this was the part Vivian had returned to again and again in her calculations, the part that made the plan in her own private accounting defensible, entirely naturally. No inquest. No suspicion. Simply a sad, common thing that happened to a certain percentage of pregnancies every year, for reasons medicine understood only imperfectly. Elena drank it every morning. She thanked Vivian every morning, often with a hand pressed briefly over her mother-in-law's on the table, a small gesture of gratitude that Vivian received, each time with a warmth so total that even Elena's newly wakened suspicion struggled to hold its shape against it. And every morning, 3 feet away at the same table, Mia watched her mother lift the cup to her lips and said nothing, because she had tried once already. In a whisper her mother had misunderstood, and she had learned, in the particular way children learn things no adult ever means, to teach them that the truth alone is rarely enough. The truth needs proof before anyone with the power to act on it will believe it over. Everything they have already decided a person is. The small room Etienne Belmont had built off the back of the kitchen. In 1911 had, over a century, served many quiet purposes. During Prohibition, it had briefly held cases of rum awaiting distribution under cover of night. During the Depression, it had stored preserved vegetables. Against a hunger the family, by then comfortable, never actually experienced. By the time Vivian came to Cypress Landing as a 19-year-old bride in 1962, it had become simply what everyone called it. The cold pantry, a narrow, windowless space with its own exterior door. Cool even in August, used for nothing more sinister for decades than storing preserves and the good silver during parties. It was here, each morning at 6:40, that Vivian performed the small, precise ritual she had rehearsed so many times it had ceased in her own mind to feel like anything unusual at all. She would lock the exterior door first, a small precaution though. Odette rarely came this far into the pantry before 7, and no one else in the house had reason to. She would set the ceramic canister on the narrow wooden shelf that had once held mason jars of Etienne's smuggled rum, and beside it, a small folded paper packet no larger than a sugar sachet that she replenished once a week from a locked drawer in her own bedroom, its contents measured out with a jeweler's precision. Scales she kept wrapped in a silk scarf at the back of her closet. She would open the canister. She would unfold the packet along its worn crease, the same crease, refold so many times it had gone soft as cloth, and tip its contents, a fine, nearly colorless powder, into the loose tea leaves, working it through with a small silver spoon in slow, even strokes until no trace of it remained visible to any eye but her own. She did this without hurry, without any outward sign of the enormity of what her hands were doing, in the same unhurried rhythm she brought to arranging flowers or reviewing a quarterly shipping report. If anyone had asked her in that room what she was thinking about, she would have answered honestly that she was thinking about very little at all, that the act had become, through repetition, almost meditative, a small, private ceremony conducted in service of a larger, more important piece she had spent 40 years protecting. It was only afterward, resealing the canister, smoothing her hair in the small mirror by the door, arranging her face into the warm, unhurried smile that had, for 4 decades, made grown men in boardrooms feel like beloved nephews, that something briefer and colder moved through her. Not guilt, precisely, because Vivian had made her peace with guilt 20 years ago, on a September evening on Lake Pontchartrain, and had not revisited the feeling since. It was closer to a kind of grim private accounting, a mental note, filed and dismissed, of what love in this family had always required of the person willing to carry its true weight. On the Wednesday of the second week, the same week Elena had begun, without fully admitting it to herself, to watch her mother-in-law more closely. Odette Fontenot was in the kitchen garden gathering time when she saw, through the gap in the boxwood hedge, the cold pantry's exterior door open and close, quiet and precise, at 6:41 in the morning, exactly as it had, she now understood, every single morning for 2 weeks running. She said nothing. She simply noted the time, the way she had begun noting it since her conversation with Elena over the field peas, and went back to gathering time with hands that, for the first time in 26 years of working in this house, were not entirely steady. Thomas Belmont was not, by nature, a demonstrative father, and he knew it. He had grown up in a house where love was expressed through provision and protection rather than embraces, and he had spent his Adult life aware of the gap between what he felt for Mia and affection. That had surprised him with its ferocity, arriving fully formed the first time she had fallen asleep against his shoulder during a car ride. And what he knew how to show her. It was on a fishing trip in April, 6 months before the garden table whisper that he had first asked her directly, the two of them alone on the boathouse dock with the gray stuffed rabbit propped between them. Like a small, patient chaperone, whether anything at Cypress Landing frightened her. Mia had considered the question with the seriousness she brought to everything, turning her fishing rod slowly in her small hands, watching the line where it disappeared into the brown water. Sometimes Grandma Vivian looks at Mommy funny, she'd said finally. Funny how? Mia had thought about it for a long moment. Like she's doing math, she said, and Mommy's the answer she doesn't like. Thomas had filed the comment away the way he filed most things touching his mother, without alarm, because alarm about Vivian had never, in 44 years, produced anything but his own quiet embarrassment at having doubted her. But something in the specificity of it, asterisk like she's doing math asterisk, had stayed with him longer than he expected, and the following week, on an impulse he did not fully examine at the time, he had brought Mia a small gift from the security consultant Belmont. Shipping used for warehouse compliance disputes, a button-sized voice recorder no larger than a shirt stud that could be sewn discreetly into fabric and activated with a firm double press. He had shown her how to work it seated on her bedroom floor, framing it carefully as a game rather than a task. If you ever hear something you think a grown-up should know about, he told her, tucking the small device into a reinforced seam along Pepper's left ear, you press here twice and Pepper will remember it for you. Then you press twice more when you're done, and it goes back to sleep. It's our secret. Not even Mommy needs to know unless you want her to. He had meant it, at the time, as nothing more than a father's instinct. To give a watchful, quiet child a private way to be heard, a small release valve for a girl who clearly noticed more than she said aloud. He had not meant it as the beginning of an investigation. He would not fully understand, for another 6 months, exactly what he had given his daughter. On the Tuesday following the garden table whisper, 2 days after Mia had watched, from the top of the back stairs, her grandmother slip through the cold pantry's exterior door at 6:41 exactly as she had the morning before, Mia sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor with Pepper in her lap, pressed the rabbit's left ear twice and said, in the careful, deliberate voice of a child reciting something she is afraid of forgetting. Grandma Vivian puts something in Mommy's tea can before she brings it out to the porch. I saw her do it yesterday and again today. She does it in the little room behind the pantry where nobody goes except her. She thinks nobody sees, but I can see the door from the top of the back stairs if I sit real still and don't turn on my light. She paused, chewing her lip, and then added, in a smaller voice, I tried to tell Mommy already. She thought I meant Mrs. Voss. I don't know how to make her understand it's not Mrs. Voss without her getting really scared, and I don't want Mommy to be scared. I just want somebody to believe me before something bad happens. She repeated the description twice more, in slightly different words, the way a child repeats a spelling word she is trying to make permanent in her memory, then pressed the rabbit's ear twice to end the recording, and hugged him tight against her chest, alone in a room where, for the first time in 2 weeks, she let herself cry a little quietly into Pepper's worn gray fur so that no one in the house, not even the person she trusted most, would hear her doing it. School had become, in the 2 weeks since the garden table whisper, the one place Mia could exhale. She attended St. Brendan's, a small Catholic elementary school on the edge of the parish where Elena had insisted, gently but firmly, over Vivian's initial suggestion of a private tutor at Cypress Landing itself, that Mia continued to go, to sit in a noisy classroom with other 7-year-olds, to eat lunch at a long table sticky with juice boxes, to be, for 6 hours a day, simply a child rather than the newest small piece of a 100-year-old family story. Her best friend there was a round-faced, endlessly talkative girl named Camille Broussard, whose own family ran a modest seafood distributor 2 towns over and who had absolutely no idea what a trust amendment was, what a cold pantry was for, or why her friend Mia had started, in the last 2 weeks, going quiet in the middle of recess games and staring off toward nothing in particular. "You're doing the thing again," Camille said one Thursday, poking Mia's arm as they sat cross-legged on the blacktop during afternoon recess. "A game of hopscotch abandoned mid-turn." "The staring thing." "I'm not staring at anything," Mia said. "You're staring at nothing, which is worse. What's wrong with you?" Mia considered the question with the same careful weight she brought to every question lately, turning it over to see how much truth it could safely hold. "Do you ever know something?" she said finally, "and nobody believes you, so you have to just carry it around by yourself?" Camille, who was 7 and unburdened by any particular subtlety, shrugged. "One time I knew Sister Agnes was going to give a pop quiz and nobody believed me, and then she did, and everybody was mad they didn't study." "It's not like that," Mia said. "It's bigger." "Bigger how?" Mia opened her mouth, closed it again. She had learned, in the 2 weeks since the garden table, exactly how far she could carry this particular weight before the carrying became unbearable, and she had learned, with a precision that made her feel, at times, unbearably old for 7, that telling a friend on a blacktop was not the same as telling someone with the power to actually stop what she'd seen. "It's a grown-up thing," she said instead, which was true and which ended the conversation the way she'd known it would. But something in her had shifted, sitting on that blacktop, watching a kickball game she wasn't part of. She understood, with the flat clarity children sometimes arrive at faster than adults, that she could not simply wait for someone else to notice what she had already noticed. Twice, on 2 separate mornings, through the gap at the top of the back stairs. Waiting had already cost her mother 2 more weeks of drinking. Something Mia now understood, with a child's imperfect but essentially correct comprehension, was dangerous. That evening, back at Cypress Landing, she did something she had not done before. She began, quietly and without telling anyone, keeping her own written record. Not words, she was 7, and her spelling was uneven, but a series of small pencil marks on the inside cover of a composition notebook she kept hidden beneath a loose board in her closet floor. 1 mark for every morning she watched the cold pantry door open and close at 6:41. By the following Monday there were 9 marks in a neat, careful row, and beside them, in her best 7-year-old handwriting, a single sentence she had worked hard to spell correctly. I am not making this up. There was one object at Cypress Landing that had never, in Elena's 14 months in the house, left Vivian's throat, and it deserves now its full history, because understanding what that locket truly held would eventually mean the difference between a family quietly surviving what was happening to it and one destroyed entirely by it. It was a small oval locket, antique silver gone soft at the edges, with 60 years of handling engraved on its face with a single cypress tree, and the year 1962, the year Vivian, 19 years old and the daughter of a shrimp boat captain from a much smaller house 2 parishes had married Augustine Belmont, already 12 years her senior, and already deep in a shipping business his own father had built on more than legitimate trade. Vivian had told Elena the story once, in the warm, early weeks of the marriage, back when Elena had still believed unreservedly in her mother-in-law's kindness. They had been sitting together on the porch, shelling peas much as Elena would later shell them with Odette, and Vivian had opened the locket to show her the photograph inside. A young, unsmiling Augustine standing on the deck of the Cypress Belle, his hand resting on the shoulder of a boy of perhaps 6 who would grow up to become Thomas. "He gave me this the week before he died," Vivian had said, closing it gently, her thumb moving over the engraved cypress tree with the particular tenderness of someone touching a wound they have long since stopped noticing hurts. "I have never once taken it off since." 40 years, Elena. "There are mornings I forget I'm wearing it at all, and then I catch its weight against my chest, and for just a moment, he's here again." It was, Elena had thought at the time, one of the most beautiful things anyone had ever told her. She had not known, would not know for many more weeks, that the locket held a second truth entirely, folded into a compartment beneath the photograph that no jeweler's inspection would have revealed unless he knew precisely where to look. Vivian had commissioned that false floor herself in the autumn of the year Augustine died, from a jeweler in Baton Rouge she had never visited before and never visited again, paying in cash, giving a name that was not her own. She had needed, at the time, somewhere small enough to carry and permanent enough to never lose, a single folded page torn from an insurance auditor's private notebook, a page dated 11 days before her husband's death, written in his own careful hand, documenting the exact figure by which Belmont Shipping's cargo loss claims had been quietly inflated over 6 years, and a final sentence underlined twice, stating his intention to bring the evidence to the Federal Maritime Board the following Monday morning. She had never destroyed that page, though she had had 20 years and 1,000 quiet opportunities to burn it, to bury it, to let it disappear the way she had made certain everything else connected to that September disappeared. She told herself, across those 20 years, in the rare moments she allowed herself to examine the choice at all, that she kept it as a kind of penance, a small cold weight worn against her sternum to remind her of exactly what love had cost her, and exactly what it had bought. It would be more honest, though Vivian herself had never once used this word in relation to her own actions, to say that she kept it the way a soldier keeps a medal from a battle he does not regret losing his innocence in, proof, worn close to the skin every single day, that when the moment had come, she had been capable of doing whatever the family required. She had built, in the wreckage of that terrible September, the entire architecture of the Belmont family's next 40 years, and she had never once let herself forget. Each morning she fastened that small silver clasp at the back of her neck, precisely what the foundation of everything she had built was actually made of. Desmond Cole had been Belmont Shipping's general counsel for 19 years, long enough to have learned the particular quality of silence that meant Thomas Belmont was troubled by something he had not yet found the words to say aloud. He recognized it the Thursday Thomas called him into the study at Cypress Landing, not the downtown office, Desmond noted, which meant whatever this was, Thomas did not want it moving through the company's normal channels, closed the door behind them both, and asked him, without any preamble at all, to pull every financial record touching his mother's personal accounts for the past 18 months. All of it, Thomas said, standing at the window with his back half turned, the posture of a man who did not entirely trust his own face. not to give something away. Every transfer over $1,000. Every account she doesn't know I know about. Every attorney she's used. That isn't me. Desmond, who had drafted 3 generations of Belmont wills and knew better than to ask why before he had something concrete to answer. With said only, is there a reason I should be worried about what I find? I don't know yet, Thomas said. That's exactly the problem. I have a feeling, and I don't like feelings that don't come with proof attached. It took Desmond 4 days, working largely at night from his own home office so that no one at the downtown headquarters would notice the unusual pattern of his research and a significant favor from a former law school classmate now working at a title company in Baton Rouge, to assemble what he laid across Thomas's desk the following Monday morning, a small, precise, and deeply strange financial trail. A trust, opened 11 months earlier 1 month, Desmond noted aloud. Before Elena's pregnancy had even been confirmed in the name of a shell entity called Cypress Holdings, funded through $40,000 in transfers from Vivian's personal accounts, structured in amounts small enough, deliberately and consistently, to avoid automatic bank reporting thresholds. A separate, smaller account holding irregular but recurring payments to a compounding pharmacy in Baton Rouge that appeared nowhere in the household's official medical billing, its purchases described only by a generic code that meant Desmond had confirmed through a contact of his own, nothing more specific than custom formulation, non-standard, and buried 3 pages deep in a stack of routine-looking corporate filings, an amended version of the family trust, drafted, Desmond, established with growing unease by an outside attorney in Lafayette, whom Vivian had retained privately, never once routed through Desmond's own office in 19 years of otherwise handling every piece of Belmont legal business that would, if formally executed, restructure the family's inheritance rights in the event of Thomas's death in a way that quietly, permanently excluded any child born to Elena from full control of Belmont shipping. In its place, the amendment inserted a guardianship clause naming Vivian sole trustee of that child's inheritance until the child's 30th birthday, a clause that, Desmond pointed out grimly, would give Vivian effective, unchallengeable control of the company for another 3 decades, regardless of what happened to Thomas himself. Desmond read the guardianship clause 3 times before he was certain he understood what he was looking at. Thomas, he said finally, sitting back in his chair, I want to be very careful how I say this, because I've known your mother 20 years and I have never once had reason to doubt her. But this trust only makes sense as a document if the person who wrote it believed, with total certainty, that Elena's pregnancy was never going to produce a child who grew up to inherit anything at all. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, looking at the amended trust with an expression Desmond had genuinely never seen on him before, not anger. Not yet, but something colder and more careful, the look of a man methodically lowering a wall he had spent his entire life assuming he'd never need. Get me the recorder, he said finally. The one I gave Mia today. And, Desmond, don't call anyone else about this yet. Not the company. Not the police. I need to understand exactly what my mother has done before I decide what to do about it. Thomas Belmont had been 24 years old when his father drowned, old enough to grieve like a man and young enough to accept, without much question, the story the family had told him ever since. Augustine had gone out alone on the Cypress Bell's smaller skiff that evening, as he sometimes did when the business weighed on him, to watch the sun go down over Lake Pontchartrain. The coroner had found a modest Amount of alcohol in his blood not enough on its own to explain anything, but combined with a sudden squall that had rolled in off the lake faster than the evening forecast predicted, it had been enough to explain, to everyone's satisfaction at the time, a capable, experienced sailor going over the side of a small boat and never coming back up. It had been, by every official account, exactly what it appeared to be. A tragedy, and nothing more sinister than a tragedy. Thomas had grown up inside that account so completely that he had never once, in 20 years, thought to question it. Desmond Cole had never had reason to doubt it either until the Monday. He laid a photocopied case file recovered after 2 additional days of careful, quiet digging through archived records at a maritime insurance firm, now 3 ownership changes removed from the one that had employed the original investigator, next to Thomas's untouched coffee, and asked him, gently, to read it for himself. The investigator's name had been Walter Pruz, a meticulous, unmarried man of 51 who had spent 26 years auditing maritime insurance claims across the Gulf Coast with a reputation among the handful of colleagues Desmond had managed to track down for thoroughness that occasionally outlasted his employer's patience. In September of that year, 3 weeks into a routine audit of Belmont Shipping's cargo loss claims, Pruz had begun documenting in careful longhand across 11 pages, a pattern stretching back 6 years, cargo listed as lost or spoiled that had, according to port logs he had, cross-referenced independently against harbor master records the company itself had never thought to falsify, in fact arrived intact and been quietly resold through a secondary distributor. The scheme, by Pruz's own conservative estimate, had generated over $2 million in fraudulent insurance payouts across those 6 years, money that had, at several critical junctures, kept the company solvent. Through 2 brutally difficult shipping seasons the industry still talked about. Pruz's file ended 9 days before Augustine Belmont's death, with a handwritten note in the margin indicating his intention to present his findings to Augustine directly, in person, before escalating the matter to federal maritime authorities, giving the family, as he'd written in his own careful hand, the decency of a warning before the hammer falls. There was no further entry in Pruz's own file. His formal investigation was closed 6 weeks later, reclassified by a supervisor's signature as inconclusive, insufficient corroborating documentation, a signature Desmond did not recognize until he cross-referenced it, almost by accident, against an old company Christmas card list from that era, and found the same name attached to a supervisor who had, according to public records, retired unusually early the following spring to a comfortable house on the Alabama coast, a house whose purchase price, by Desmond's rough calculation against typical insurance industry salaries of the period, would have required roughly 4 years of additional savings the man's employment history did not appear to account for. "She paid someone to bury it," Thomas said quietly, when Desmond had laid out the whole trail. It was not a question, and something in his voice had gone flat in a way Desmond had never heard from him in 19 years. "I think your father was the one who was actually going to bring it forward," Desmond said carefully. "I think, Thomas, based on everything I've found, that somebody made very sure he never got the chance to." Thomas sat with that for a long time in the quiet of his study, looking at the framed photograph on the wall of a boy on a dock with his father's hand resting on his shoulder, the same photograph, though Thomas did not yet know it, folded small enough to fit inside a locket his mother had worn against her chest, without exception, every single day for 20 years. Thomas did not confront his mother that week. He had learned, across 44 years of watching Vivian Belmont move through rooms full of powerful men who consistently underestimated her, that direct confrontation was a tool she had always been better at wielding than absorbing. Instead, on Thursday evening, over a dinner Vivian herself had overseen roast duck, the good silver brought out from the sideboard. Candles, she said, were just because he set a small, deliberate trap and waited to see whether his mother would step into it. Elena's doctor wants to run additional blood work next week, he said, watching his mother's face over the rim of his wine glass with the same patient, unhurried attention he brought to a difficult contract negotiation. Something about her blood pressure trending up faster than they'd normally expect this early. They want to catch anything concerning before it becomes a real problem. It was, in fact, entirely true. Elena's obstetrician had called that very morning, mildly concerned, entirely unaware of the reason behind the numbers she was seeing. Thomas had simply chosen, with deliberate precision, to say it out loud at this exact table, in this exact company, and watch what his mother's face did with the information. Vivian's fork did not pause on its way to her mouth. Her expression did not shift by any degree a stranger might have noticed. But Elena, seated beside her, felt the older woman's hand resting near her own on the white tablecloth, close enough that their sleeves nearly touched go. Very slightly, almost imperceptibly still, the particular stillness of a hand whose owner has just performed a rapid, silent calculation. Well, that's what doctors do these days, isn't it? Vivian said, lightly, reaching for her water glass with a steadiness Elena would later think back on with a kind of horrified admiration. Worry first. Explain later. In my day, they simply told a woman to rest more and eat her greens and trust her own body. She turned, smiling, to Elena. You have been resting, haven't you, dear? Drinking your tea every morning, just as I showed you. Every morning, Elena said, and did not fully understand, as the words left her mouth, why the question sent something small and cold moving through her chest, quick as a fish beneath still water. Across the table, Mia, who had spent the meal quietly pushing green beans into a careful, untouched pile at the edge of her plate, saying almost nothing, the way she had said almost nothing at every family dinner for the past 2.5 weeks, looked up at exactly the instant her grandmother's eyes flicked, briefly and almost too fast to register, toward the cold, untouched teacup sitting beside Elena's water glass. It was the smallest possible thing. A half-second glance, gone before anyone else at that candlelit table could have named it as anything more than idle attention passing across a crowded surface. But Mia had spent 2.5 weeks learning to read this house the way her stepfather read shipping manifests for the single detail that did not belong, and she saw it clearly, and she understood, with the flat, unsentimental certainty of a child who has already stopped hoping to be wrong about something this important, that her grandmother had just heard the word blood work, done arithmetic no one else at the table knew to perform, and filed the result away behind a smile that had not moved even a fraction of an inch. Later that night, after the dishes had been cleared and the candles blown out and the great old house had settled back into the particular silence Elena had once mistaken for peace, Mia found her stepfather alone in his study, working late over a stack of papers he was not really reading. She did not say anything. She simply held Pepper up toward him with both small hands, the careful, ceremonial gesture of a child handing over something precious, and pressed the rabbit's ear twice. Thomas listened to it 3 times before he fully trusted his own hearing. The first playback, in the hushed quiet of his study with Mia curled asleep on the leather couch beside him. She had insisted on staying, had refused, with a seriousness that made something in his chest ache. In a new and unfamiliar way, to be sent to bed until he had heard every word gave him only the raw bones of it, his daughter's careful, frightened 7-year-old voice describing a small room behind the pantry, a canister, his mother's hands doing something quick and evidently well-practiced with a spoon and a small folded paper packet, before resealing the canister and carrying it out to the porch with her warmest morning smile already fixed in place. The second playback, with Desmond patched in on speakerphone from his home office at nearly midnight, his own voice going tight and unusually gentle as he coached Thomas through the questions to ask his daughter. Not directly, not yet, but through her father, because Desmond would not let himself speak to a 7-year-old about any of this until there was no other option left, gave them a fuller shape, 3 separate mornings, the same small back room, the same careful, repeated ritual, described with the specificity of a child who understood, on some level. Thomas found almost unbearable to consider. That specificity was the only currency that might eventually be believed. It was the third playback, done alone after midnight with a small recorder propped on his desk and his father's old photograph watching him silently from the wall, that finally gave Thomas the thing he had been holding at arm's length across 4 days of ledgers and coroners reports and quietly rerouted insurance investigators, not proof. Precisely, a recording of a 7-year-old describing a spoon and a canister would never, on its own, stand up in any courtroom, but certainty. The particular, cold, total certainty that arrives not through any single piece of evidence, but through the sudden alignment of 100 small things that had never quite fit together until this exact moment. His mother's quiet insistence on making the tea herself every single morning, refusing even Odette's offer to help. Her gentle, repeated suggestion over recent months that perhaps a smaller, more manageable family might be easier on a young mother's fragile health. The amended trust Desmond had found, already drafted, already waiting for a child who had not yet been born and was not, in his mother's careful private arithmetic, ever actually supposed to be. He sat for a long time in the dark study with his sleeping daughter curled against his side and his father's photograph watching from the wall and the small mechanical weight of the truth sitting heavy in his hands. Then, quietly, so as not to wake Mia, he picked up his phone and, for the first time in 19 years of knowing him, asked Desmond Cole a question that had nothing to do with contracts, trusts, or corporate liability. "How do I make her stop?" he said, his voice low and unsteady in a way he had not allowed it to be in years, without destroying the only family I have left doing it. Desmond was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, the kind of silence a careful man holds when he is choosing his next words, with real weight. "You don't do it alone," he finally said. "And you don't do it in anger, Thomas, because anger is exactly what she'll be expecting, and your mother has spent 40 years learning how to survive other people's anger. You do it the way she would do it, carefully, with proof she can't talk her way around. In front of witnesses she can't charm. And you give her exactly one chance to explain herself before the truth becomes something bigger than either of you can control." They did not confront Vivian inside the main house. Thomas had thought carefully about the setting, the way his mother had spent decades teaching him, without ever meaning to teach him this particular lesson, to think carefully about a room before he negotiated inside it, where the power in it naturally sat, where the exits were, who could hear what through which walls. He chose the boathouse instead, the small, weathered structure at the foot of the property where the Cypress Bell's eventual replacement, a modest fishing boat Augustine had commissioned and never lived to use, had sat gathering dust for 20 years. There was a room above it, reached by an exterior wooden staircase silvered with age, that Vivian had converted decades ago into a kind of private study, a place she had always told the family, to feel close to Augustine. Thomas had never once questioned, in 44 years, why his mother needed a room 100 yards from the main house to feel close to a man whose portrait hung in nearly every hallway of that house. He understood it now, walking up those weathered stairs on a warm Saturday afternoon with dread sitting cold in his stomach. It was the one room in the world she had never had to perform in. He had asked her to meet him there, telling her only that he wanted to talk about his father, about the 20th anniversary of his death, approaching that spring, about whether she might finally want to do something to properly market, a scholarship perhaps, established in Augustine's name at the Maritime Academy he'd once supported. It was, in its own careful way, entirely true. He simply left out the rest of what he intended to say. Desmond was already waiting when Vivian climbed the stairs, seated quietly in the corner of the small room with a leather folder resting closed on his lap, the particular posture of a lawyer present as a witness rather than, not yet, an adversary. Elena waited below, inside the boathouse itself, at Thomas's own insistence, close enough to hear, if she needed to, far enough that he could give his mother, even now, even here, the smallest possible mercy of not having to say what he was about to say directly into the face of the woman she had spent weeks learning to fear. Vivian looked from her son to Desmond, to the closed folder resting on his knee, and something in her posture, held so carefully composed for so many decades that Thomas had genuinely never once seen it waver, finally, quietly, settled into a stillness that was, for the first time in his memory, entirely unguarded. "You found the trust," she said. It was not a question, and there was no surprise in it at all, only a kind of tired, almost relieved resignation, as though she had been waiting for this exact conversation far longer than Thomas realized. "I found more than the trust, Mother," Thomas said quietly. He crossed the small room, set the recorder on the low table between them, and, without another word, without giving himself the chance to reconsider, pressed play. The room filled with his daughter's small, careful voice, *Grandma. Vivian puts something in Mommy's tea can before she brings it out. I saw her do it. She does it in the little room behind the pantry where nobody goes except her *, and Vivian closed her eyes, not in surprise. Thomas understood as he watched her, but in something closer to the particular grief of a woman who has just heard the exact shape of her own undoing spoken aloud in a child's voice for the very first time. It is worth pausing here, in this quiet, terrible room above the boathouse, to return properly to a question that had followed Elena for nearly 3 weeks without a satisfying answer. Why had no one, not Elena, not Thomas, not even, for the first several days, Desmond himself, considered that Mia might have met her own grandmother? The truth, once the boathouse door was closed and the recording had finished playing, turned out to be almost embarrassingly simple, and it said far more about the adults in that house than it ever said about the child who had been trying to warn them. Renata Voss had been easy to suspect precisely because she had made herself so effortlessly easy to suspect, loud, visibly resentful, the kind of person a family tells itself stories about because the alternative, looking honestly at someone they actually loved, was simply unbearable to consider. Vivian, by careful contrast, had spent 40 years making herself functionally impossible to suspect, not through secrecy but through its precise opposite, total radiant, overwhelming visibility. She hosted every holiday at Cypress Landing. Without fail. She remembered every birthday, every allergy, every small kindness a person in this family could ever be remembered for. She had built, across 4 decades, an alibi constructed not from hidden absences but from 1,000 acts of consistent, visible love. The particular genius, Desmond would later observe privately to Thomas, of a woman who understood instinctively that the surest way to hide a single dangerous decision is to bury it inside 10,000 ordinary. Kindness is so consistent that no one would ever think to weigh one against the other. Desmond, out of simple due diligence during that same frantic week, had quietly looked into Renata Voss's own finances, her recent movements, any conceivable connection she might have had to the household. He found nothing beyond exactly what everyone already knew: petty jealousy, a decade-old country club grudge over lost business and a daughter's disappointed prospects, and an unpleasant tendency to say cruel things loudly enough to be overheard. Renata had never once set foot in the room behind the pantry. She had never had access in 14 months to Elena's morning tea. Her only true offense in the end was being openly, tiresomely unkind in public, which had made her, tragically and almost darkly comically, the perfect unwitting decoy for a woman who had learned, decades before Renata ever entered the family's orbit, that the surest place to hide a wolf is standing close beside someone who already looks like one. Mia had understood this before any single adult in the house managed to, because children, mercifully unburdened by decades of learned social deference, are sometimes the only people left in a room still capable of watching without deciding in advance who has earned suspicion and who has already earned trust simply by being kind often enough. She had not needed motive or bank records or 20 years of family history. She had simply watched her grandmother's hands, 3 separate mornings in a row, do something careful and hidden in a room where no one else in the house ever went, and she had trusted with the plain, unsentimental clarity only a child still possesses, what she had actually seen with her own eyes over everything she had ever been told about who this particular woman was supposed to be. Vivian did not deny it. That, more than anything else that happened in the room above the boathouse, was what stayed with Thomas. Afterward, that his mother, given the clear choice between denial and truth, chose truth the way she had chosen nearly everything else in her life, deliberately, unflinchingly, entirely on her own terms. Your father was going to burn this entire family down for a principle, she said, once the recording had finished and the small room had gone very quiet around the 3 of them. $2 million in claims that kept nearly 800 families fed through the worst shipping years this port ever saw, and he was going to hand every last dollar of it to the federal government because Walter Prus made him feel guilty over a bottle of scotch one evening. I did what needed doing, Thomas. I have never once, in 20 years, regretted doing it. I would do it again tomorrow morning to keep this company standing for you. And Elena? Thomas's voice, when it finally came, did not shake, though something in his chest felt as though it might never fully close. Again. Was that for the company too, Mother? A baby who hasn't even been born yet. For the first time in Thomas's entire life, Vivian looked, briefly, genuinely uncertain, not of the underlying facts, which she recited with the same flat, practiced precision she brought to a quarterly report, but of how to shape the next sentence into anything other than exactly what it plainly was. A child born under that new trust would have diluted operational control the very moment it turned 18, she said finally. Your father's fatal mistake, Thomas, was believing principle mattered more than survival. I was not going to repeat his mistake a second time. Not for a stranger's baby. Not even, in the end, for yours. She's not a stranger, Elena said quietly from the doorway where she had climbed the stairs without either of them fully noticing, one hand resting, as it had for weeks now, protectively over the small curve, where the danger had been growing all along, unseen, one careful teaspoon at a time. She's your own grandchild, Vivian. Vivian looked at her for a long, unreadable moment. Something crossed her carefully composed face, not quite remorse, Thomas would think later, turning the moment over for months afterward, but something closer to the particular, bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who has spent 40 years being certain she was right about everything and has for the very first time in all those decades run entirely out of ways to make being right sound anything like being good. I loved your father, she said finally, addressing Thomas alone, deliberately ignoring Elena the way she had, in some quiet fashion, ignored her from the very first week of the marriage. I have never once stopped paying, every single day since, for loving him the way this family required of me. I am not sorry for what I built out of that love, Thomas. I am only sorry, truly sorry, that you were the one who had to be the one to find out exactly how I built it. She reached up with a steady hand, unclasped the small silver locket she had worn without exception every single day for 20 years, and set it gently on the low table between them, beside the recorder, beside Desmond's closed leather folder, beside a torn page from Walter Pruse's own notebook that Desmond had, quietly, already matched against a true copy preserved in an archived insurance file. 3. Ownership changes removed from the original firm. Do whatever you need to do, she said, her voice steady even now. I built this family from nothing, Thomas, with these two hands. I will not beg any of you to let me stay inside it. Vivian Belmont was never publicly charged with anything. Desmond made certain of that in the weeks that followed the confrontation above the boathouse, not out of any mercy toward Vivian herself, he was careful to explain to Thomas more than once, but out of a hard, practical understanding that a public prosecution would inevitably drag Augustine's 20-year-old fraud, and by extension the livelihoods of the 800 families still working for Belmont Shipping, and Elena's still fragile, still monitored pregnancy, through a scandal none of them could afford to survive intact. Instead, over 3 long, exhausting weeks of private negotiation, conducted almost entirely inside Desmond's office with a second attorney present to represent Vivian's own interests, a resolution was quietly assembled. Vivian signed a full, irrevocable transfer of her remaining shares in Belmont Shipping to Thomas. She signed a permanent removal from any position of authority, formal or informal, within the company's governance structure. She agreed, in a clause Desmond drafted with particular care, to a quiet relocation away from Cypress Landing entirely, to a modest house on the Alabama coast that, Desmond noted, with a grim private irony, he shared with no one but Thomas, sat less than 11 miles from the retired insurance supervisor's own comfortable retirement home, the compounding pharmacy in Baton Rouge, when Desmond's investigator quietly visited under the pretense of a routine compliance audit, turned out to have no record whatsoever connecting its custom formulation work to any named patient. The transaction handled, as Vivian had carefully arranged from the very beginning, entirely in cash by an intermediary who no longer worked there and could not be located. There would be, Desmond confirmed grimly, no clean forensic path from teacup to conviction, even if the family had wanted one. The recording of a 7-year-old describing a spoon and a canister would never, on its own, have survived serious legal scrutiny. It had never needed to. It had only ever needed to be true enough to make Thomas finally see clearly. Word moved through the parish the way word always did in a place where 3 generations of families had watched each other's fortunes rise and fall across the same church pews and country club dining rooms. No one outside the immediate family ever learned the specific, terrible truth of what had been in the tea. The official story, carefully constructed and quietly maintained, was simpler and, in its own way, almost plausible, that Vivian, in her advancing years, had decided the time had finally come to step back from the company she had run since her husband's death, to enjoy a quieter life by the water, and that Thomas, ever the dutiful son, had helped arrange her comfortable retirement. Renata Voss heard a slightly different version, filtered through the particular rumor mill of the Terrebonne Founders Club, one that suggested, without any of the details Desmond had actually uncovered, that something serious and private had gone wrong inside the Belmont family, serious enough that Vivian herself was gone from Cypress Landing entirely. She approached Elena at a charity luncheon 6 weeks later, uncharacteristically hesitant, a version of herself Elena had genuinely never encountered in 14 months of careful, cultivated cruelty. "I heard Vivian's left the house," Renata said, turning her wine glass slowly by its stem, not quite meeting Elena's eyes. "I won't pretend I know what happened. But I want to say," she started again, visibly working to say something that did not come naturally to her. "I said some genuinely unkind things to you over this past year. I told myself it was because I thought you didn't belong in these rooms. I think, if I'm honest with myself, it was because I was jealous of a happiness I convinced myself I'd been owed and wasn't. That doesn't excuse it. I'm sorry, Elena. Truly." Elena, who had spent nearly a month learning, in the most painful possible way, exactly how dangerous it could be to misjudge which woman in a room actually posed a threat, found she had no real appetite left for holding a grudge against one who had, in the end, only ever been unpleasant, never actually dangerous. "Thank you for saying that," she said simply, and meant it, and the two women, if not friends exactly, found something like an uneasy, workable peace in the months that followed, enough that Renata's own daughter and Mia would, by the following spring, end up on the same recreational soccer team without either mother quite planning it that way. At Cypress Landing itself, Odette Fontenot continued exactly as she always had, though something in her had settled in the weeks after Vivian's departure that Elena recognized as a kind of long-carried weight finally set down. She never fully explained, and Elena never fully asked, precisely how much Odette had suspected across her own 26 years in that house, watching a young bride become a widow, become the quiet architect of everything that followed. But one afternoon, kneading biscuit dough in the same unhurried rhythm she'd used the very first week Elena arrived, Odette said, without looking up from her hands, "This house feels lighter now, Miss Elena." I didn't know how heavy it had gotten until it wasn't anymore. Elena had not trusted herself to answer that with words. She had simply crossed the kitchen and hugged the older woman, flour and all, for a long moment. Neither of them felt any need to explain Elena's blood work once the tea stopped entirely, and a full panel of independent testing at a hospital in New Orleans confirmed nothing more alarming than a healthy, normal pregnancy finally free of whatever had Been quietly working against it for weeks, normalized within 3 careful weeks of monitoring. Her obstetrician, unaware of the true cause behind the numbers that had worried her, simply noted with quiet professional satisfaction that sometimes these things resolve themselves with adequate rest, and Elena, sitting in that examination room with Thomas's hand tight around hers, had to work hard not to laugh at the particular, terrible irony of the word rest. The months that followed were not, Elena would tell people honestly in later years, simply happy ones. Grief and relief, she learned, could occupy the same house at the same time without ever fully resolving into each other. There were nights she woke in the dark, certain she'd heard a kettle being filled downstairs, only to lie rigid in bed for several long minutes before remembering that the sound was impossible. Now that the woman who had made it every single morning for months was 300 miles away on the Alabama coast, there were mornings Mia still watched the kitchen doorway with a wariness that took a full season of gentle, patient reassurance and, eventually, 6 months of weekly sessions with a warm, careful child psychologist in New Orleans that Thomas insisted on without hesitation and without ever once making Mia feel that needing them meant something was wrong with her, before it began, slowly, to soften into something closer to ordinary childhood distraction. Thomas, for his part, found himself doing something he had not expected, grieving his father properly, for what felt like the first time in 20 years, now that he finally understood the true shape of what Augustine had actually died trying to do. He commissioned, quietly, and without any public announcement, a scholarship at the Maritime Academy in Augustine's name, not the vague, symbolic gesture he'd once half-planned as a pretext to get his mother into the boathouse, but a real, substantial fund supporting young maritime insurance investigators. Committed, the endowment's language specified with a precision Desmond had helped him craft, to integrity in an industry that too often rewards its absence. He visited Walter Pruse's grave that autumn in a small cemetery outside Homa that no Belmont had ever visited before, and stood there for a long while in the humid afternoon heat, saying nothing aloud, before quietly arranging, through an intermediary, for the modest headstone's long-neglected upkeep to be permanently funded going forward. The baby, a boy, they learned that following spring at an ultrasound appointment where Mia, invited along for the first time, watched the grainy black and white image on the screen with an expression of such complete, unguarded wonder that Elena had to look away for a moment to keep from crying in front of the technician, was born healthy on the 14th of April, in a hospital room crowded with more people who genuinely loved Elena than she had, in 14 exhausting, difficult months of marriage, ever quite let herself believe this family was capable of producing. Odette was there, having driven in from Cypress Landing at 4 in the morning the moment Thomas called. Desmond waited outside with flowers he'd clearly bought in a hurry and would not admit to being nervous about presenting. Even Renata Voss sent a handwritten card, unprompted, that made Elena cry harder than almost anything else that entire exhausting, joyful week. They named him Raphael Augustine Belmont, Raphael for the father Elena had lost too young, Augustine for the grandfather Thomas had only truly begun, that year, to properly understand and grieve, and Mia, 7.5 years old now, holding her new brother for the first time in a hospital chair with a nurse hovering carefully nearby, looked up at her mother with an expression Elena would remember for the rest of her life. I kept my promise, Mia said quietly, so only Elena could hear it. I told the truth even when it was hard, and I didn't stop even when You didn't believe me the first time. Daddy Thomas says that's the bravest thing a person can do. It is, Elena said, her voice breaking on the words. It's the bravest thing anyone in this family has ever done, baby. I promise you. That? Vivian wrote to Mia occasionally, in the year that followed, careful. Formal letters posted from the small house on the Alabama coast, always. Addressed in the same precise, old-fashioned hand Mia had once watched. Sign restaurant checks and school permission slips without ever once suspecting what else those hands were capable of doing. Elena read every letter first alone, before deciding, each time, whether Mia should see it, and more often than not she found herself handing them over, not out of forgiveness, exactly, which was a word Elena was still, a year later, working carefully to understand her own relationship to, but out of a belief, hard-won across a difficult year, that a child deserved the chance to decide for herself what to do with the complicated people who had shaped her life, rather than having that decision made entirely on her behalf by adults still nursing their own wounds. Vivian never once, in any of those letters, apologized directly for what she had done. She wrote instead about the weather on the Gulf, about a small garden she had started keeping, about a photograph of Mia's baby brother Elena had sent her once, unprompted, that Vivian mentioned keeping propped on her windowsill. It was, Elena came to understand, the closest thing to remorse Vivian Belmont's particular architecture of self had ever been built to produce, not confession, but a kind of careful, ongoing tending of the small threads she had not entirely severed, offered without ever quite asking to be forgiven for having nearly severed them all. Mia kept every letter in the same composition notebook where she had once tracked 9 careful pencil marks against a door that opened at 6:41 each morning. She did not write back often, but she did write back, twice that first year, in a child's careful, evolving handwriting, and Elena never asked to read what her daughter chose to say, understanding, finally, that some conversations belonged entirely to the people having them. It was on a warm evening the following October, 13 months, almost, to the week, since the whisper at the garden table, that the fog rolled in low over the bayou exactly as it always did, and Thomas found Elena on the screened porch with baby Raphael asleep against her shoulder and Mia curled beside her with a picture book she had long since outgrown, but still liked to have read to her some evenings, for the comfort of it rather than the story. He sat down across from them with a small velvet box he had been carrying, folded carefully into his coat pocket, for 11 days. Uncertain until this exact moment, the fog settling, the mockingbird running one last time through its whole ragged repertoire of borrowed songs before the light finally failed, whether the timing would ever feel entirely right, or whether there was simply no such thing as a perfect moment for what he wanted to ask, only a willingness to ask it. Anyway, I've been thinking, he said, and his voice, usually so measured, so careful with its own edges, wavered slightly on the words in a way Elena had rarely heard from him, about everything this house has put you through since the day you walked into it, about everything it nearly cost you. And I keep coming back to the same thought, which is that I don't want the next chapter of this family's story to be one you simply survived. I want it to be one you chose, deliberately, with full knowledge of exactly what you're choosing this time, rather than walking into it the way you did before, trusting a house you hadn't yet learned to be careful of. He opened the small box. Inside, resting on dark velvet, was not the formal, heirloom-heavy ring Elena might have expected from a family like this one, but something smaller and, she understood immediately, far more deliberately chosen. A simple band, unadorned, with a single small Stone that caught the last of the porch light exactly the way the fog caught it softly without demanding attention. "I know we're already married," Thomas said, and something in his face, the careful composure he had inherited and spent his whole life perfecting, finally visibly loosening, made Elena's breath catch in her chest. "I know this isn't a proposal in the way the word usually means it, but I wanted to ask you again, Elena. Properly this time, knowing everything I know now, having watched you survive something I still struggled to fully forgive myself for not seeing sooner. Will you stay? Not because you signed a paper a year ago, not because this house has any claim on you at all beyond the one you choose to give it. Will you stay because you want to, with a family that finally, truly understands now what it almost lost, and what it owes you for surviving it anyway?" Elena did not answer right away. She looked at her sleeping son, warm and heavy against her shoulder. She looked at her daughter, 7 years old and already, in ways no child should ever have had to become the bravest person in this entire family's long, complicated history. She looked, finally, at Thomas, at a man who had spent 44 years learning to guard himself against exactly the kind of danger his own mother had ultimately turned out to represent, and who had, in the end, chosen truth over comfort even when the truth cost him the only parent he had left. "Always," she said, and this time, unlike the first time she had said it, 14 months earlier, in a marriage built more on grief and gratitude than on anything either of them had yet earned the right to call real trust, she meant it completely, with the full, hard-won knowledge of exactly what this family was, what it had nearly cost her, and what, in the end, it had chosen to become instead. Mia, without looking up fully from her picture book, reached over without a word and pressed the small hidden button sewn into Pepper's worn gray ear once, quietly, just to be sure the moment would be remembered properly, exactly the way it happened, by someone who had learned, the hardest possible way, exactly how much it mattered to have proof that the good moments were real too. This story was never really about poison or trusts or a fraud buried for 20 years at the bottom of a Louisiana lake. It was about the particular, quiet courage it takes for a child to keep telling the truth after the first person she tells it to gets it wrong, and about how rarely we teach children that this kind of courage is worth anything at all. It was about how easily families mistake performance for love, applause for safety, and total visibility for total honesty. Vivian Belmont was never a monster in the simple way that word usually implies. She was something far more familiar and far more uncomfortable to sit with, a woman who convinced herself, across 40 careful years, that protecting what she had built and protecting the people living inside it were the same act, until a 7-year-old girl, watching a house the way only children still know how to watch, without deciding in advance who has earned trust, proved her wrong. The people who try to buy your silence, this story asks its audience to remember, are almost never the people who actually love you. The people who perform love the loudest in the most public rooms are not always the ones quietly protecting you in the small, unwitnessed hours of an ordinary Tuesday morning. Real safety, this story suggests, rarely announces itself. It simply keeps watching, keeps recording, keeps whispering the truth even when the people it loves most are not yet ready to hear it, and it waits, with more patience than any child should ever have to carry alone, for someone to finally believe.